Welcome to Ausfilm Creatives, a podcast about Australian creatives working behind the camera. My name is Peter Szilveszter and I'm your host. Welcome to the show. This little intro is a little bit about who I am and what the goal of this podcast will be. So you may have guessed I work in the film industry. I work as a cinematographer and colorist in Australia. I was born in Hungary, but I pretty much consider myself an Australian. I guess going back to my early life of why and what made me get into films, I would say one of my earliest memories that really, I guess, inspired me to make films in some shape or form. It was back in Hungary when I was 5 years old and saw E.T. at the cinemas. It would have been in Hungarian dub, but I've seen the film lots of times in English since, so that's how I remember it. And I just remember very vividly wanting to know how to be in that world. So I didn't really have an idea what filmmaking was, but just how to be in it and how to kind of create something like that. And later on, I actually saw Never-Ending Story as well. It may have been a year later, I'd say. And that was, it was just so interesting and visual. And I guess that always stuck with me, that kind of genre of filmmaking, because it just showed that the medium can show live action, fantasy visuals. And that was really exciting for me, and I kind of always loved movies ever since then. And once we moved to Australia in 1990, so I think I just turned 10 years old or just before, one of the biggest impacts was in that teenage years was Aliens. Like, that film, still my favourite. Nothing's really kind of taken that mantle, because to me it's just a film that encompasses everything great about films and storytelling, and it's got a full gamut of action, adventure, drama, romance, comedy, and to me that's what a great film is. So luckily during high school days, met some friends who also obviously loved movies, and back in the 90s it's very different to today, but back then I guess you had VHS and you could go to the movies, but you probably rewatched the same movie because you didn't have that kind of instant access you do today. So, we would just be all our favourite movies we would just watch all the time, all the big action movies, being young boys, we're into that kind of action thing. And managed to get a video camera from the school that let students use for their own little projects. And so we would basically try and imitate action movies, Predator, Aliens, Indiana Jones, all those kind of movies, and try to recreate some of the scenes, but like make spoofs of them as well. So we try to create our own little story around it. And we made a heap of those kind of films and had a lot of fun. It didn't really take it serious, but we took it to the next level. I had an old computer, an Atari ST, where we'd get samples and put all the gun sounds in and use 2 VHS recorders and trying to overlap the edit and, add soundtrack to it and voiceover and things like that. So, we had no training. We just kind of made it up as we went from what we knew from books and some behind the scenes, videos or movies that we might have seen back then. And later in my life, I finished school and then decided I needed to do something that something practical. I looked around for universities, but back then in the late 90s, there wasn't a huge amount. Unless you had high qualification, you could get into the more prestigious film and acting type of schools. But I didn't really have that, didn't really have the money. And ended up studying 3 years at a TAFE course, which is more of a trade college. And really, it was the best thing ever because it was just all practical. There was a little bit of theory, maybe one day out of the week, but it was, pretty much they they just let us run and gave us projects to do, and also ended up doing real world things where it was to live to air TV, but also they had really quite a good range of equipment for us to shoot with. They had all the lighting gear, they had the best kind of video cameras you could have at the time, but also we also had access to all film cameras from 8mm to 35mm. So we learned everything there. We started with before we started shooting film, we actually had to study black and white photography and color photography, but basically doing it from the get-go. So you did the processing and enlarging and all that. So you really figured it out how to shoot on film as well before even going to motion picture, which was great. Yeah, so basically we ended up shooting a lot of little short films, had experience shooting documentaries, and like I said, real world things where we actually did projects for people, music clips. And yeah, that was really, really important for me because I'm, I guess, a very practical person in a way. And basically after that, I guess the reality check came, and realized that it's not so easy getting into films, and unless you've kind of found a crew. And I tried that. I really tried to get work on different films and work on short films and things like that. But the problem was they were always unpaid work, and and you spend a month of your life while still working at a job to try to pay the bills, because a lot of these films didn't pay us any money, and then at the end of it, they never get finished. So it was quite heartbreaking, and it was a bit of a real reality check. And I kind of was trying to figure out, how do I move on from here? And trying to get you do your normal canvassing and try to get work on things, but just a lot of knockbacks. We've all been through that. So I actually decided in my 20s to kind of save up and start buying equipment myself. And sort of throughout there started doing little projects and started a video production business called Living Lens. And and from there, we really, I really got to evolve as a filmmaker, because not only did I learn, obviously, get even better at the craft of filming and editing and shooting, but also how to deal with people at different levels, different professional levels. Clients can really teach you a lot of things, and patience and things like that. And so, that's really added a lot to my life skills. And, spent about 7 years on that business, and then slowly started getting back into trying to work on short films and trying to do more creative work again. But now I had at least equipment with me that I could kind of offer if it needed to be. And so that friend, Matthew, from back at school, I kept in touch with him, and he ended up working as a stop motion animator, because that was sort of his first love, doing commercials. And then he ended up actually making his first feature film, like entirely on his back, like just on weekends. And it was a period piece, so it was like pretty crazy. But, he continued trying to make films in the meanwhile. And so we'd been keeping in touch, and he'd, I guess, seen obviously all the work I've been doing. And so we decided let's see if we can do something together that to see how we work as well, because high school and then almost 20 years later, you don't know how we'll work together. So we decided to make a little short horror called The Artifice. And it just worked. We worked out really well. Like within that 2.5 days, I think we shot 4. We were doing everything shorthand. Halfway through probably the project, we just knew exactly what how we worked and what we understood. As far as filmmaking. With that film, I did the color grading and the VFX as well. So. It was pretty crazy, but it was a really good experience. And the great thing is as well for the tech nerds, I guess, that, we shot back then, this was 2014. I had a Canon 5D Mark III, but we decided to try and shoot with the experimental raw hack that some geniuses came up with. And it worked amazing. Like we had, I think, maybe one hiccup where we might have lost a few seconds and then that's it. But it ended up being my first ever digital project that I shot raw. At this stage I still hadn't had access to RED cameras and any of those cameras back then. But it paid off. Like we screened it at Astor Theatre in Melbourne, which is like a massive, they usually project 70mm films and things like that there. And I was kind of pretty worried just how it's going to look, but yeah, it really held up, and I was quite surprised. And people had really been blown away, surprised that it was shot on a Canon RAW camera, not like a higher end cinema camera. So after we finished that film and Matthew had put it into festivals, we talked about doing something he'd been working on for years and years, researching, which was about the bushranger Ben Hall. So he's not so well known, across the world. People know Ned Kelly more so, but his was quite an interesting story, and Matthew had been working on that because Ned Kelly had already been done a few times, and he wanted to make a bushranger film, but very historically correct. And so he came up with the idea that maybe why don't we see if we can get the interest of people that really love historical films and obviously support. And so he did a Kickstarter campaign later in the year to do a 30-minute short film, just a section of it. I think it was the last, I don't know, it would have been the last 90 days, I think, of Ben Hall. And so, we raised over 100,000. It was just amazing for an Australian Kickstarter campaign for a short project. To raise that much money was just, amazing. And for me, it was like, this is freaking amazing. Like, because I had been such a fan of Westerns specifically, and bushranger is not the same level, but it still has that, period piece and that real raw stuff. And this story was very much about that. It was a lot of stuff outdoors, and how these bushrangers lived off the country and just roamed the country, but in an Australian setting. And favourite Westerns are Sergio Leone Westerns, so The Good, Bad and the Ugly and Once Upon a Time in the West and Fistful of Dollars. As a kid, seeing all those amazing Westerns where it felt a lot more raw than Hollywood films did. And I just really was like, wow, I was so inspired, and I was like, let's do this, and let's see if I can bring some of that in, some of those inspirations from the Sergio Leone films. So we got the money, and it was an insane 2 weeks of filming. It was just nuts. Like, obviously pretty much everyone worked for very little money, if nothing at all. And everyone had to stretch themselves to make this film. But, luckily we had a good crew and it was very passionate. Although it was very hard shooting for me as a DP because so many people were volunteering their time. So I unfortunately didn't have a consistent crew throughout. It would made it hard because, you'd have a camera assistant for a few days and it would change. So, that was insane. But Matt has a very strong will, and he, during the production, he just, exudes endless energy to keep people pushing and the crew to complete the film. And so this actually became a feature film down the track. So what had happened is there was a trailer cut, and some of the right people saw the trailer and they just went, wow, this looks like a big sprawling epic. It needs to be a feature film. So luckily got a few producers on board that found more money and raised enough budget. Still was on a very ridiculously low budget for, imagine this is all, 90% of the film was shot outside. So it was all outdoor. It was all nature. It was a period piece. So it was all costumes. Everything had to be, none of this stuff existed. So the budget was very, very, very tight. But, like the feedback we got from seeing people saw that trailer and they went, wow, this looks like a multi-million-dollar production. They were just amazed some of the feedback we got. So luckily within a few months, so we shot that at 214 September-ish, August, September. And then we went back on pre-production at around, it would have been, I think it was March next year. And the film, Matt's original idea, he already had a massive script. He had an original 300-page script that we worked off. So he obviously still had to cut it down because that was still too big. But there was a very large amount of story to be told, and so it wasn't hard to it wasn't about extending a short film into a feature film. It was just that this was a method to see if we can make it in, see if we can get the money to make a feature film and basically just embed some of the footage. Which, some of the footage we shot, we did have to reshoot because timing wise and some of the things didn't work for the feature length script. But yeah, so that's how essentially Legend of Ben Hur was born. And it took, I think, around 10 weeks of shooting. Maybe, had a okay amount of pre-production time. And we also even ended up shooting a miniature shoot later down the track when post-production was well on the way, because we obviously couldn't afford to build a back lot or a small town, or they don't really exist. So yeah, we had to make up some miniature shoots and do some VFX and insert people and things like that. But we still got lucky. There's a couple of scenes where we found a location, an TV series set that was set during those kind of 1800s time. And so we could use some of that as well. So yeah, we got lucky in a lot of ways. It was still extremely hard work. Like it just was, wasn't the, I guess for a first feature film for myself, it was a real mind-opening experience. Like I grew thousandfold just through that process. And it made me realize, to get through a film, to stay consistent was probably the biggest challenge when you are so limited with budget. And yeah, so I mean, it was a lot riding on my shoulders, obviously even more so for Matt directing the film. But, it really, the payoff was that people saw the cut at the end and it, people said, oh, this looks like a multi-million-dollar film and, $8-9 million kind of thing. So that really showed the skill of everyone involved, how, what we achieved as a film. And so, it was full of compromises and, every department had to compromise in some way. The production designer, Das, what they did with the minimal money and just resources by finding, offcuts and things like that to try and build some of the facades that they built outside. And obviously when we did have a studio shoot, but yeah, it just was, everyone involved was just amazing. So on that project, after they've spent a long time on the edit, I did the color grade, and luckily I could do a lot of it at home because unfortunately I needed that time, because what had happened is on set, there was no DIT, no people that would look through your footage and check if it's right or correct it to be ready for, post-production. So everything I got and whatever cameras we had available. So also the other big thing is we had variations of RED cameras. So they didn't actually look the same. And then we also had some Canon footage and even Panasonic GH4 footage. So, there was a lot of footage that needed to be matched and made sure it's all right. So I luckily got to spend a little bit of time at home on my own little studio to color grade it and then go into the proper grading suite to make sure everything's right and spend a couple of weeks on that. So, yeah, so the payoff was, I guess, bittersweet. We had really good responses from local people, and the biggest hurdle we had was, unfortunately, we didn't get the the support of the larger cinemas. We just couldn't get the money to promote the film well enough, so that it couldn't be picked up in the normal cinemas. So in Australia, unfortunately, it didn't do that well. It did screen in 30 or 40 cinemas during a 1 week period and stuff. But luckily in the US, we had a pretty good reception for it, not in the cinemas, just all the other platforms like streaming and buying DVDs, sold a lot of units. And so, the film was fairly well received. As always, there was going to be negative and positive reviews. I managed to win a few awards for it, for the cinematography. So, that says a lot. I mean, it's not just me that won it, but a few others have won other things on the project. But it's everyone included that made the film look as good as it is. So that took I probably spent a total of 2 years on that project, because I'd spent a lot in, pre-production with Matt, going through things and how to make it work. And then in post, I did a lot of other things as well. I was visual effects supervisor, so I had to deal with that. There's a lot of other little things I had to be part of it until it finally got out and got to see it on the big screen. But it's an amazing feeling when you get to see your first feature film on the big screen and people receiving it so well. And that's something, that hopefully no filmmaker or cinematographer or any filmmaker takes it for granted, because I think it's so valuable to complete a project and see it at the end there. And I guess from there I continued working on short films, mini documentaries, music clips, and I'm attached to several feature films in the future. So hopefully the money comes through and we get to make another feature film, all different genres. But it's trials and tribulations getting a film made in Australia, because money's so small, such a small industry. And to make money from it, it's much harder. So that's essentially what I've been working on and who I am. And I guess I really wanted to start a podcast, because I don't have access easily to people, and and see what other professionals are doing and talking to them about it, and specifically Australians, because like I said, it's a tough industry here. It's tough in the US, of course, but here you do have very, very little money. You can't there's no big projects. Like, yes, we sometimes get some of the bigger US films coming here, and we may end up working on them, but we certainly, if you wanted to make your own story, there's very little money here. And so it's a tough industry. So I kind of wanted to talk to other filmmakers, but basically anyone working behind the camera. Really, I want to focus on the unsung heroes that we don't really get to hear from. So even though I'm a cinematographer, and this season I will focus mostly on cinematographers, but I really want to get other creative roles behind it, gaffers, makeup artists, production designers, art directors, camera operators, anyone that kind of impacts how that story is told, and also maybe roles that, people don't know that well, to hear their stories and, what it involves them making it. I'd also really like to try and cover, I guess, in-depth discussions about their workflow and processes and who they are and experiences, and some interesting stories and their take on the industry. So hopefully the guests that I have lined up will cover some of those things. And I will also be getting Australians who are working abroad, whether it's in LA or Europe somewhere. It's, it'd just be interesting to hear how Australians have transitioned from Australia to the other countries, and I'm interested to see how possibly it is, how they see those industries compared to Australia, and I guess what we have to offer, and they're kind of hardworking because of the I guess that very mentality of working with as little as possible. So I really hope that you'll join me and hear the perspectives from other people. And so I guess that's about it for me. And to get things rolling, our very first podcast will be with Abraham Joff ACS. who actually was the Cinematographer of the Year for ACS, Australian Cinematographers Society, in 2016. So it'd be really interesting. He's a very self-made filmmaker. So he's done a Netflix series called Tales by Light, and beautiful, amazing cinematography. The first episode will be released on the 27th of May on the Monday, and will be followed with fortnightly releases on every Monday after that. So make sure to subscribe on your favourite podcasting platform that you like to use. It will be available on iTunes, on the website. You can follow us on Facebook, Instagram. So it'll be all there. Hopefully you follow my journey and learn some great little nuggets on the way as well. And I look forward to sharing all our stories from all our different filmmakers.